We are very grateful for his leadership and his ministry at St. Francis of Assisi, and we truly appreciate his support of our efforts in the Central Region. He is a dear friend, an awesome speaker, and I know that we are in for a great treat this afternoon. Will you please join me in welcoming Father Joseph Campion? Thank you,
Isn't she wonderful at embellishing everything? I didn't even recognize myself in that introduction, but it's good to be here once again. I spoke here at the Food for the Journey a few years ago, and Father James always has us on a rotation to give some thoughts and some insight into my own faith journey that somehow I hope in a way can help you to integrate your faith journey. And perhaps today some of the topic will get us into things that are heavier than the meal we just had, but then hopefully we'll leave here light with the Holy Spirit to go about and do God's bidding. When I asked Father James, I'm saying, this is August. I don't know what topic to talk about. It's the year of mercy. I'm afraid that the previous pastors and the priests men here talked about mercy. I said, I don't want to do another one on mercy. And so Father James gives me the second cousin of mercy, and that's justice. So today's topic will be on justice. And this is a very difficult issue to navigate through. First of all, because I had a hard time with the Dominicans and the Oblates of Mary Immaculate grasping justice. And you just don't understand a Dominican when they get into Thomism and theology. So when I went and started looking at justice, I was having flashbacks to 1988 and 89 when I was taking these theologians and commutative justice, distributive justice, justice of God, social justice. Oh my God, how am I going to deal with this whole thing? And so I'm not going to talk to you about commutative justice and distributive justice because I don't know what it is. And so we're just going to talk about St. Thomas Aquinas' classic definition of justice, and that is to give another person what is their due. Not too hard to remember. Give to another person what is their due. And this is where we want to situate this, keeping it ever before our eyes, giving to other person what is their due. I always refer back to the great prophet Micah of the Old Testament. I think it sums up the whole Christian life. It sums up everything in just one line of how we need to live our lives. And so Micah asks and gives this question, and what does the Lord expect or require of you? To act justly, to love mercy, and to walk humbly with your Lord. Three things. Love justice, to act justly rather, to love mercy, and to walk humbly with your Lord. If we could just put those three things together, we're saints and we're homeward bound to the heavenly glory. And it's easier said than done. But Micah heard those words of God, shared it with you and me, and so wants us to truly act justly toward others. Love the sense of mercy. You notice how those two virtues are put side by side. Mercy and justice cannot be separated. And you have to have a sense of mercy in order to bring justice into the world. And then, of course, walking humbly with our Lord. We can't walk in our own strength. We can't walk in a sense of cockiness that I know all the answers and I have all the methods and means necessary to get myself to heaven. We will sadly realize if we don't have the foundation of humility, we will not have the virtuous life to carry on the way the Lord wants us to do. So, when we talk about justice, the most important thing, first of all, is justice that is owed to God. We can't really begin to talk about giving another person their due if we first don't give God his due, right? And so we have to be able to give God his due. And I am so happy that as I was raised in Jamestown, New York, see, a lot of times when people say, oh, Father, you're from New York, what's it like in New York City? I said, I don't know. You've probably been there more than I have. I'm 8 hours away from New York City. My father grew up in New York City, but he moved to the other end of the state. I'm way over near Buffalo. South of Buffalo, I'm in a town of about 30,000 people. So what's that, like Opelousas? So that's like asking someone from Opelousas, what's it like to live in New Orleans? I don't know. I don't live there. And so I grew up in this small town of 30,000, tucked away in southwest of New York, south of Buffalo. That's the diocese I belong to. And I had two very, very good parents. My dad, 86 years old, my mother passing away 10 years ago this month. But truly, truly rock solid Catholics. And you talk about any idea of justice to God, that was brought to us at an early age, as it should be with all good parents. And that is that God deserves glory, majesty, reverence, worship, praise, and devotion in all that we do. And so even though I was born in 1960, and we, a couple times in the Irish Catholic families, we have what's known as those Irish twins, that they're only about 9 months apart in age. So we have a couple of those. My younger sister and I are, for about 10 days, we're about the same age. So the Irish Catholics, as so many others, having children, listening to God, and understand the vocation of marriage, being fruitful, and raising your children in the fear of the Lord. And so in the 1960s, when it was so turbulent and anti-authoritarian, it crept into our own bones as kids. Why do I have to go to church? This is boring. I don't understand what you get out of it. It's the same thing every week. I don't want to do this. Well, my parents didn't care. You're going to church. You live in this house. Until you move out, you're going to church. Even if you move out at 30, you're going to church. It's the justice of God. We owe him worship, praise, and that was a non-negotiable issue inside my mother and father's house. And incidentally, my dad at 86 is still a daily communicant today. He loves going to church. It is what he feasts on day in and day out. And so it wasn't just empty words. It was something that was given to his children, even though with five brothers and two sisters, some are in and some are out of the church, just as we all have, right? And so that's just the spiritual journey people are on at particular times. But inside the house, justice of God was mandatory and giving God his praise. And the thing about it is, you really can't speak about justice going and flowing out into the world unless it first is flowing from ourselves. We can't be saying, the Our Father, give us this day, may your kingdom come and your will be done on earth as it is in heaven, if we're not praying it, if we're not living it, if it's not internalized. And so God's heavenly kingdom needs to break into this world in which we live and to truly show us the way that things have to be. And so this God that you and I serve, this Trinitarian God, it's a God of three persons, but he's one in essence. And so Father, Son, and Holy Spirit are perfectly loving and perfectly just in and of themselves. And God is a family. And that God as family must overflow into our society and into our world today. And so we have to begin to ask ourselves, am I a reflection of the Trinitarian God that I worship in what I say and do when I go out into the world this day? And so when we talk about justice to God, it's to give him glory and praise and worship. Then from that flows the rights that are due to other people. And sometimes we have to speak about the things that are owed to other people in the sense of material things and money, and that has to be taken into consideration. Just think about this last Sunday's reading. It's a convicting reading from Luke's gospel. And what does he say? Thus will it be for all those who store up treasure for themselves, but are not rich in what matters to God. Storing up things for ourselves rather than giving over to what matters to God. Now, anytime we read the gospel, we have to realize, as Paul says, it's a two-edged sword. And we ought to be convicted at times. We're the wealthiest nation in the world. God has supplied us with a tremendous amount of comforts that other nations do not have. We don't have to feel necessarily guilty, but it has to convict us. And so sometimes what happens in this is we get defensive. I don't want to hear about that. I've got my comforts and I've got my things and I like what I have. And so I don't really want to hear about this gospel that tells me I have to embrace abject poverty, which it does not do, but it does make us wary of being overly indulgent and being overly embracing the things of this world. And the second thing, the other side of that is, if we're not feeling defensive, then many times we're feeling accusatory. Sometimes we don't have what other people have, and so we try to throw guilt onto somebody else. And so we either try to use Jesus to shame others who have, or we try to get governments to say, tell them to give that money over to that person so that we have an equitable society. And so we try all these machinations of trying to have the distribution of wealth of others, but it really does not get to the essence of the matter. And what is the essence of the matter? It was found in both of our readings. First of all, the letter of the Ecclesiastes, or the wisdom literature. Koheleth is an interesting person because he reflects a lot of people in our world today. How does he open up? Vanity of vanities, all is vanity. Life is nothing but one endless cycle of eat, drink, and be merry, and then you die. And that's it. When we talk about vanity, we can talk about vanity when we go and look at ourselves in the mirror, and that's kind of a self-indulgence there. But the vanity that he's speaking about is that there's a futility of life if we live that way. It has no purpose. It's directionless. If it's all about living for this world, and so the book of Ecclesiastes is a very, very pessimistic book situated in the Old Testament. It is one of those books in the Old Testament that there's no reference made to God. Why is that? He wants to show us how futile our life is without God. And so Koheleth has led to this conclusion that he is somebody who does not find life to have much meaning. Now, he's not a bad person. He does not lack natural virtues. He has those. But he's come to the conclusion that there's nothing new under the sun. And why is that? Same as why Jesus tells us in today's gospel. Why is this that this person has all of this and he says, what am I going to do with it? I'll go and build bigger storage things, and then I'll just sit back and have a relaxing life. And then Jesus, through the parable, says, you fool. This day, God is going to call you home. What good is the life that we have if we're just storing up things and we're different? But once we put God into the situation here, once we put him into the situation, then there's a whole new meaning. Because what does God do here? He challenges us where we are. He's not going to accuse us. He's just going to say, if you're following me, that means you have to have radical love, radical generosity, radical sacrifice, radical witness to who I am. And that means you have to have this love for people outside yourselves. It cannot mean, if you're going to truly be a godly person, and if you're going to be a Christian, it cannot be self-indulgence. It is looking out to the goods and the needs of others so that we give of ourselves generously rather than having the government impose it upon us or have someone else come and try to shame us into the things that we need to do. Back when I was in college, and from 78 to 1982, I went to a Jesuit college in Syracuse, New York, very small college of 2,000 people. It was a time where the academics, just like all Jesuit institutions, are very good. But I remember distinctly sitting in classes and being troubled by what was being taught in some of the classes. A lot of the Jesuits at that time, in the aftermath, rightfully, in interpreting the gospel, said Jesus Christ has a preferential love for the poor, which he does. Jesus, when he was born in a manger, it was very clear he embraced poverty and identified with the poor. And yet what the Jesuits began to proclaim, especially in Central America, was that because Jesus identified with the poor, this is what we have to do. And that means we have to bring Marxism and socialism, and we have to engage in class warfare so that people hate each other and will not get along. And so St. Pope John Paul II really plugged into my heart at that time, because I'm saying there's something not right here where you have to choose up. And so what was going on in Nicaragua, and I've been there twice as a visit, and going into El Salvador, was in Nicaragua you had the Somozan regime, politically were conservatives. The Sandinistas politically were leftists and socialists, and then of course you had those who were considered the Contras, who were caught in the middle trying to make a living. So you had this abject poverty, you had terrible corruption, and so you had a lot of the Jesuits in the Catholic Church unfortunately going in and saying, join up with this side, go to the Sandinistas, and go over there and fight with a sword, kill if you have to. Always keep the conflict going so that there's always going to be a boogeyman of the rich, and there's always going to be the victim of the poor, and keep that going. And John Paul II comes in and says, no, there's a third way. And that third way is the prophetic voice of the Catholic Church. It is the prophetic message of looking at each person and saying, we are not here to fight each other, we're here to give each other their due. And so even when he went to Nicaragua, and he was in the city of Managua, the corrupt government pulled the plug when he was trying to preach during Mass. tried to silence him as he was offering the sacrifice of the Mass. Why? Because his prophetic voice was there to change hearts. And in changing hearts, then we begin to change structures. And we can't do it the other way around where we engage constantly in a conflict of one group to another. And so he gives us a different way. We have to look for people that show us a different way. At that time, when I was in college in the aftermath, there was this Bishop Oscar Romero, and his life is up for canonization. Again, Oscar Romero was in El Salvador. Same situations as Nicaragua. And here was a guy who was, by most people's terms, very introverted, very bookish, an intellectual, not engaging in society too much or in the events of the church. And yet as he was brought out to be a bishop, and he saw the inhumanity going on, he saw the corruption, he saw the oppression of the poor, he had to say something under the direction of the gospel. Not, once again, to engage in conflict among classes, but to simply be an advocate against injustices. And Oscar Romero, as he continued to do that, was made very unpopular. And while he was offering up the holy sacrifice of the Mass, elevating the consecrated hosts and the consecrated wine, he was shot through the hearts. Witness to Jesus and injustices many times will cause us to look and say, that person was not engaging in conflict among people, but he went outside the box and began to bring a prophetic message of how humanity needs to treat each other, and was willing to lay down his life for that means. As Mary said to you, I am a Josephite priest, and a Josephite priest is one who works exclusively in the African American community in the United States. It was begun in 1871, thinking of our history when the terrible Civil War ended. The Catholic Church met in Baltimore and said, we have to do something about the evangelization of the newly emancipated slaves. What are we to do? And so Cardinal Vaughan over in England sent over priests to the United States to work in the United States. From 1871 till 1891, it was the Mill Hill Fathers. In 1891, that group of men broke from the Mill Hill Fathers, established an American community known as the Society of St. Joseph of the Sacred Heart to work here in the United States in the African American community. And it was a rough history and rough going, obviously, with the climate of its times. Inhumane segregation that was taking place. Sadly, within our own Catholic Church, black people were relegated to second-class citizens within the church. The Josephites had a difficult time ordaining black Catholic men because they weren't allowed to come into a diocese to bring the church and the sacrament to life. So there's always been kind of a healthy competition that goes on between the Josephites, myself, and the Divine Word Fathers, of which Father James is a part. Because there's always the thing, well, who's the first one to get the black priest in the United States? And so we had Father Charles Uncles. Who was your first? Tolst? You don't remember Father James?
What?
Your first black priest in the
First four,
yeah.
Rousseau, Vincent Smith, Wade, and what's the other one?
Four of them ordained at the same
Burgess.
time. Mhm. Yeah, four of them ordained.
1934,
Yeah,
Bay St. Louis,
Bay St. Louis.
by Bishop.
So he knows his history. Look at that. But we have to understand the climate.
Bishop Jerome,
we-
Mississippi.
Mississippi, Bay St. Louis. And so we have the Josephites and the SVD fathers have been working in the African American community side by side ever since. And it was not an easy task to do. And so we have to understand we've come a long way, but this was not what was ideal in the church and in society at the time. I like to believe that the Josephites and the Divine Word Fathers are truly the first and the most authentic Black Lives Matter movement. And so we really, truly came. And we had a different method. And our method was to bring the gospel of Jesus Christ, the sacramental life of the church, to all people so that we can bring salvation to everyone. And so it was very important work that we have been doing over the years. So in 1985, when I went to my parents and told them that I was going to I've been discerning a call to the priesthood, and then I've applied to the Josephites. My mother and father were shocked. The Josephites? Why not the Jesuits? You went to, I went to that college. I know what that's about. Nothing to denigrate Jesuits. They are a great group of men and the largest in the church, but my experience there was not the best. And I just didn't feel called to the Diocese of Buffalo where I was at the time. And so I had to begin to examine myself. Why did I follow the Josephites, knowing what their work was? We had a member of our family that we knew very well, Father Jim Hayes, who is now in his 90s at our manor up in Baltimore. He was the contact I had as a human person that was involved in the Josephites. But then it has to go deeper than that when you begin to look at things. And you have to remember, as I said, I was born in 1960. I don't remember the I Have a Dream speech of Dr. King. I was too young at that time in 1963. But my mother always said, imagine sitting up there listening to this on television, coming across the airways out of Washington, D.C. My mother always had an astute sense of when history is being made. And I remember her saying when I was a young boy, that was a historical speech. There are people that come through history at times that really, truly speak in ways that are transcendent, that speak to the heart of the matter that's going on right now, and most importantly, give us a different way of looking at how things ought to be. And so when Dr. King came along, he was a great inspiration. And also in the same time as I was getting to be about 10 or 12, another person, not in the Catholic tradition, that was very inspiring to me was the Reverend Billy Graham. You know, this guy could go to Yankee Stadium and have it full. And he's speaking his convictions of his heart. And you knew that this was somebody who was touched by God and speaking in such a way. But with Dr. King, you know, a lot of us don't realize what he was trying to do and navigate at that time as a prophet of justice is on the outside, where you had clear inhumane treatment of his own people, the Bull Connors and the people being lynched, people who were being burned, people who were being hosed, children, the dogs. Everything that we saw coming into our televisions in the 1960s was repulsive to us, and he had to fight that. On the one hand, the injustices, and then what we don't realize is what was going on inside the civil rights movement at the same time. And I had the great privilege of going to a lecture by Taylor Branch. He wrote 2 big books called Parting of the Waters about the whole civil rights movement. And many of us don't realize that as Dr. King was coming with his nonviolent approach to addressing injustices, he had within the civil rights movement, he had Malcolm X, who started out very strident and wanted to solve this issue by any means necessary, including violence. He also had the Black Panther movement that was going on inside the civil rights movement that was very strident and very violent. And also he even had within his own circle Jesse Jackson, who he had troubles with. I can see why, because at times he just was an aggravating person who wanted to go with great zeal. So you had him trying to balance what was going on inside the civil rights movement with what the terrible crimes that were going on outside for his people. And yet he constantly said, we have to be brothers and sisters to each other. And in order to overcome these injustices, we have to realize the saving power, the moving power, the changing power of love in a man and woman's heart to bring about the social changes that are necessary. So easily we want to grab and hold on to a violent means to get to our ends. So many times we want to find a quick thing that we think is going to bring something to a close, when in reality it just makes the wounds grow deeper and deeper and deeper. And so Dr. King was one of those who was a great inspiration to me going way back. And yet we also have to realize that we cannot begin to address a lot of these injustices in the world without first realizing that we can talk about justice of material goods and what is owed to another person, but we have to get to that one basic right, and that is the right to life. If we don't have that right to life, really all other issues of injustices are very, very difficult to address. And so I'm very happy also that I was raised in a family that was solidly, unambiguously, and unapologetically pro-life. My parents knew before 1973, when Roe versus Wade was passed, they saw the handwriting on the wall coming. They knew this was going to happen. And for any of you that were around at that time, you older ones of the generation, sadly that the abortion issue at that time was narrowed down to the Catholic issue. That's the Catholic Church that has to address that issue. And that there were not a lot of denominations getting on board to address the right to life of the unborn child. Now we have seen this burgeoning, this growing of a pro-life movement going on in our world today that needs to take place, that is across the spectrum. As a matter of fact, we have to begin to look and see that sometimes our Christian brothers and sisters across the aisle are sometimes more strident, more fervent, and more committed to the pro-life issue than sometimes we are in the Catholic Church. But again, in the 1980s, when I was in the seminary, and you just have to know seminary climate. Narely does a day go by or a meal go by in the refectory that we're not having theological, animated discussions about the hottest issues of the day. And you could have a real Donnybrook going on at one table and over at that table, because as seminarians, we think we're all more infallible than the Pope. And we all think that we have the answers to life's questions. And we go into this thinking that I'm going to make this great and powerful difference in the world if they'll just listen to me, because I have all the answers that's going on. But it became a place where, in the seminary, where you had a lot of banter of ideas going around. And one of those things that started to creep in to the seminary at that time, and I remember I was home in Jamestown and speaking with my pastor, and he and I clearly had some differences of approach and how things go, and he knew my pro-life position, and he said, well, you know, there's other life issues. And I said, like what? And there are life issues. It's not to denigrate or say there aren't. There's a lot of them. And so when we look around and see that there are issues of health care and issues of housing, issues of racism, and even issues of the environment. And that's where he kind of floored me. When Father said to me, you know, other than abortion, you have to realize there's also acid rain. I was like, acid rain and abortion are the same thing? I don't get that. I'm sorry. I'm not computing that 50 million lives and the possibility of acid getting into our rain and falling on the ground is somehow directly taking away innocent human life. I don't get that. I'm sorry. So there are times where we have to begin to realize that we're going to talk about a seamless garment, so to speak, that there's life issues across the board. Yes, there are. There are life issues across the board, but even if you're going to have a seamless garment, you have to begin with a stitch, and that first stitch is the right to life. You can't really get to the rest of these issues, and first you say, first, every human life is precious. Every human life has a dignity, and they have a right to be born. And then after that, they have a right to their dignity, whether it is with housing, health care, living in safe neighborhoods, having good schools. All those things then become a consistent ethic of life. But if you can't get to that fundamental one, and then you have a law that allows the slaughtering of that life, then we clearly have problems in our land about the fundamental injustice that's going on right now, and that is that where babies, innocent lives, are not allowed to be born and have the protection, and the government has protected the right to that slaughter. We have to do something about that, and when we see the injustices going on in our land. And so it's very important that we look at the life issues among us. And in the last month, it's very, very important for us to understand what has been going on in our cities. And what's going on in our cities, whether it's in Ferguson, Missouri, whether it's in Baltimore, Maryland, whether it's in Baton Rouge that we sadly saw just a few weeks ago, or in Dallas, Texas. Again, we're getting caught into a box at times that we have to be very careful of. Are you with all Black Lives Matter? Are you with all Blue Lives Matter? And that seems to be, you got to choose one or the other. It can't be both. And why not? Why can't it be both? And we have to do like Dr. King did, like Oscar Romero did, like the Pope does. We have to step outside and say, we have to address this in a different way. Address it we must. We cannot just simply wash our hands and walk away and say, that doesn't affect me. Because then we get back to the gospel passage today, where Jesus, from Sunday, where Jesus making sure that we are radicalized by the love and justice of Jesus Christ to go out and change the world in which we live. So what do we do? Sometimes we feel so powerless, and yet we should not feel that way at all. We're not going to overcome all injustices in this world today. There's no doubt about that. But I would suggest to you, and this is where we have to have food for thought, and we need to go away with a resolution in our own hearts. But I really have a profound respect for the police chief in Dallas, David Brown. What an intriguing man he is. I'm not sure that you read or realized, but when he was made the police chief in 2010, just 6 years ago in May, an African American running the police department in Dallas, within about a month or a month and a half after that, he got a call of 2 people being shot and killed, one being a police officer. And the perpetrator of that crime was shot and killed. And as it turned out, it was Police Chief Brown's son. His son was bipolar. His son was on PCP. And so here's a police chief, lover of his own police department, lover of his own son, having to break the news to the police department and had to grieve over the loss of his son. What is he supposed to do? His son's life doesn't matter? Blue lives don't matter? Family lives aren't shattered? This guy was in a terrible, terrible predicament throughout all of it. And so when he was recently interviewed the other day on television, a couple weeks ago, I thought it was beautiful. And what he said is, the police department is asked to do too much, and they are. He said they're asked to be dog catchers. They're asked to go in after schools have collapsed to substitute for all the crime that's going on in the schools. We have closed down mental health institutions, and so the cops are called in to take care of that. Family life is crumbled away, and so when father figure's not there, the police department is called in to do that. The police department is called to step in on every social situation that's crumbling around us. He says that's not really what we're called to do. And so he said to the demonstrators, some of those demonstrators who were saying, what do we want? Dead cops? When do you want them now? He said, step out of the line in which you're in, step out of the protest line and grab an application and join us in the police department. Be a solution, not a squawking voice doing nothing but fomenting division. And that's what we have to begin to do, to realize that we don't have to be advocates one side or the other and sit rigidly in those positions, but we have to say, Jesus, what do you want me to do? How do you want me to be an instrument of your justice? How do you want me, when I leave this world, and there's not going to be a U-Haul behind my hearse, when I leave, what do you want of me, and what am I supposed to do? And we don't, again, have to do great things. Small things, as St. Teresa of Calcutta tells us, small things can go a long way. And I do like the idea of paying things forward. You've heard it, you've seen it. The other day on Facebook, there was a young man. He probably didn't have a whole lot of money. He was dressed in his uniform for the day, and he obviously was a painter. He had paint splashed all over his clothes. And he was at a Cracker Barrel. What city? I'm not sure. But he looked across and he saw a young black woman with her child, and he said to the waitress, I want to pay for her meal. And she came over to him, and he in tears saying, I'm just so tired of the hatred that's going on. I'm tired of what I see. And this is just my small way of saying, I love you, I want to give to you. And those kind of gestures are really what we have to do. I'm tired of what I see, but I can do a small thing. A lot of you are such good Catholics, if you see a priest, you're going to pick up the tab. Don't do that, because the tab is paid for in the collection anyway, right? So when you see a police officer, go over and tell the waitress, that's on me. When you see the military, that's on me. When you see a black man, a black woman, say, that's on me. Begin to pay it forward to each other so that you say, we're all part of this. We're all in the family together. And if we don't do the just thing, if we don't love mercy, and if we don't walk humbly with our Lord, it's going to be very hard for us to establish a new way and a new world that Jesus wants us to do. So this is food for thought. Yes, it's heavy, but it's real. It's what our world is about. And you and I are here for a very short while, and the Lord is going to ask us, as St. Francis did in his prayer, Lord, make me an instrument of your peace. God bless you, okay?